Hello, everyone. Today, my partner and I will be sorting these 8 wonderful Republican presidential candidates by their poll rating from lowest to highest, and we'll be using the Quicksort algorithm.
So the first thing we do is we choose a pivot. We're choosing Rubio with a poll number of 9.9 because he's close to the middle of our array. And we look at our candidate that's being pointed to by our blue marker, and we find that his score, 6.7, is not greater than 9.9. So we move on, and we look at Kasich with a score of 3.3, and we find that this is not greater than or equal to 9.9. And then we go again, increment again, and we find Carson with a score of 18.4, which is greater than Rubio at 9.9.
So now we have to look at our other marker, so that's our red marker, and it's on Bush with 7.1. We know that 7.1 is less than 9.9, so we can just leave that marker where it is instead of incrementing, or decrementing rather. And now we can switch Carson and Bush.
So we decrement our red marker by 1, and we increment our blue marker by 1.
And that's something that we have to do every single time we make a swap. Now we do the same thing as before. So Rubio is equal to, Rubio at 9.9, so we don't have to change our blue marker. And Paul is less than Rubio's 9.9, so what we can do now is switch them.
After we switch, we again increment our blue marker by 1, and we decrement our red marker by 1. So now we look at Fiorina, and we find that her polling score of 8.9 is less than Rubio's 9.9. So we increment, and then we look at Trump, whose score of 23.7 is greater than Rubio's 9.9.
So we leave the blue marker right there. Now, for the red marker, we see that Trump is greater than Rubio, but we need to find someone who's less. So we decrement our red marker, and we see now that the two have crossed.
So this means that we split our array into 2 subarrays.
So our first 5 and our last 3 are in order, as in our first 5, who are still out of order,
are all less than Rubio's score of 9.9, and our second array contains all the candidates whose scores are greater than or equal to Rubio's score of 9.9. So we look at our first subarray and we choose a pivot. We're choosing Bush at 7.1 because he's the candidate in the middle. So we look at Cruz with a score of 6.7, and we know that this is not greater than or equal to 7.1. So we increment, and we look at Kasich at 3.3. We know that this also is not greater than or equal to 7.1. We look at Bush with 7.1, which is equal to 7.1. So we leave our blue marker where it is.
Now we look at Fiorina. 8.9 is greater than 7.1, which is not what we want, so we need to decrement our red marker. And we see that Paul is 2.6, which is less than 7.1. Now that means we can switch Paul and Bush. And as we said before, since we've done a swap, we need to increment our blue marker and decrement our red marker. And we notice that they've crossed. That means we can split these two into 2 subarrays.
So now we look at our first subarray, and we choose a pivot, Kasich at 3.3. So we look at our blue marker. It's pointing at Cruz with a score of 6.7, which is greater than 3.3. So we leave our blue marker where it is. And then we look at our red marker, which is pointing to Paul at 2.6, which is less than Kasich's 3.3.
So now that we have our markers where they are, that means we can switch Cruz and Paul. And then, as we said before, we need to increment blue and decrement red. Now, both of them are on Kasich, but we can't really switch Kasich with himself or anything, so we need to just decrement our red marker again and increment our blue marker.
Now we need to split into subarrays.
Since they're all just subarrays of 1, that means they're already sorted. So the first 3 are going to be Paul, Kasich, and Cruz.
And we can merge these 3 arrays.
Now we need to look at our next subarray of 2, which was Bush and Fiorina.
So we choose a pivot of Bush, and we find that our blue marker pointing at Bush with a score of 7.1 is equal to Bush at 7.1. So we leave our blue marker where it is. And then we look at Fiorina at 8.9, and we want something that is less than 7.1, but 8.9 is not. So we decrement our red marker by 1.
And now both our red and blue markers are on bush at 7.1. So as we said before, we can't switch bush with himself, but we're just done because these are two subarrays of 1, and they're already in order.
So then, because they're in order, we merge them.
And then we can also merge that with our first array if we would like. So we have our first 5 candidates in order: Paul, Kasich, Cruz, Bush, and Fiorina. Now let's look at our last 3 top polling candidates.
So we choose a pivot, Rubio, because he's in the middle with a score of 9.9. So we look at our candidate that's being pointed to by our blue marker, and we find that Trump has a score of 23.7, which is greater than Rubio's 9.9. So we leave our blue marker where it is.
Now we look at Carson with 18.4, and that's greater than Rubio's 9.9. That means we have to decrement our red marker. Now we see that 9.9 is equal to 9.9, which is where our red marker is, so we can just leave that there, and now we switch Rubio and Trump.
And because we've switched, we increment our blue marker by 1 and decrement our red marker by 1, which means that the red and blue markers have passed each other. So now this is the end of this phase, and we divide into 2 subarrays.
Once again, Rubio is just a subarray of 1, so that's already in order. Now we just need to look at the subarray of Trump and Carson. So we see that Trump, so we'll first pick our pivot, which will be Trump, and then we see that Trump is, equal to Trump, so we can leave our blue marker there. And Carson is less than Trump already, so we can leave our red marker there. And now we just switch the 2.
And because we've switched, we increment our blue marker by 1 and decrement our red marker, which means that since they have passed each other, this is the end of this phase, and we divide into subarrays.
Now, since they're also subarrays of 1, we're just done. These 2 are already in order.
So we can merge these 2.
And then we merge that with Rubio's. And our top 3 are in order. And as we know before, our bottom 5 were also in order before, so we can just merge that. And so we have our 8 candidates in order. And this algorithm will run in, on average, n log n time, but in a worst case scenario, n squared time. And that would happen when each time you choose a pivot, you either choose the lowest or highest polling candidate.